6 months later, the Double R Ranch looked different than it ever had before. The changes weren't dramatic enough that a casual visitor would notice immediately, but to Jake, who had been living and working there for 8.5 years, the transformation was remarkable. Solar panels now supplemented the ranch's power supply. A sophisticated water management system had been installed to better utilize natural rainfall, and native plant restoration was underway in several areas that had been overgrazed in previous decades. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the landscape at all. It was in the people who called the ranch home. Sarah had taken the job that Ray offered her, turning down the position in Billings after 3 days of careful consideration and long conversations with Jake, Ray, and Martha. The work was challenging and fulfilling in ways she hadn't expected. Instead of traveling constantly to work with different ranchers, she was able to dive deep into a comprehensive conservation project that was becoming a model for sustainable ranching practices throughout the region. More importantly, she had found the connection she'd talked about that first night. Her relationship with Jake had developed naturally and steadily, built on shared values, honest communication, and a mutual respect that strengthened everything else between them. They had moved slowly and thoughtfully, learning about each other's dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. But perhaps the most unexpected transformation had occurred in Ray Hutchinson himself. On this particular morning in March, Ray stood in his kitchen drinking coffee and watching through the window as Jake and Sarah worked together to repair a section of fence damaged by the winter storms. At 66, Ray had been contemplating retirement for the past few years, wondering what he and Martha would do with the ranch when they were no longer able to manage it actively. The arrival of Sarah and the evolution of Jake from a reliable ranch hand into something much more like a son had changed everything about those retirement plans. Ray had begun to see a future for the Double R Ranch that extended far beyond his own lifetime. A future where the conservation work they'd started would continue and expand. "You're thinking serious thoughts this morning," Martha said, joining him at the window with her own cup of coffee. "Want to share?" Ray put his arm around his wife of 43 years, marveling as he always did at how well she could read his moods. "I've been thinking about that conversation, Jake, and I had yesterday." The conversation Ray was referring to had taken place in the barn while they were checking on the spring calves. Jake had approached him with a proposal that had been both surprising and deeply moving. Jake wanted to buy the ranch from Ray and Martha, not immediately, but over time through a carefully structured agreement that would allow the older couple to retire comfortably while ensuring that the ranch remained in hands they trusted. "He's serious about wanting to stay here permanently," Martha observed, watching as Jake helped Sarah lift a heavy fence post. "And she's serious about him." "They're both serious about the land," Ray replied. "That's what matters most. Jake understands this place in a way that most people never could, and Sarah sees possibilities for conservation work that I never would have thought of. Together, they could turn the Double R into something really special." The proposal Jake had presented was thoughtful and realistic. He had been saving money for years, living simply and avoiding the kind of expensive lifestyle that would have prevented him from accumulating capital. Sarah's salary from her conservation work, combined with grant money she'd been successful in obtaining for their projects, would supplement Jake's savings. They weren't asking for charity or an unrealistic deal, just the opportunity to take over the ranch gradually in a way that worked for everyone involved. "What did you tell him?" Martha asked, though Ray suspected she already knew the answer. "I told him I'd discuss it with my beautiful and brilliant wife," Ray said, kissing the top of Martha's head. "But I think you know what I want to say." Martha nodded, smiling as she watched Sarah laugh at something Jake had said. "I know exactly what you want to say. The same thing I want to say." The truth was that Ray had been hoping for something like this for months. Jake had proven himself over the years to be not just a capable ranch hand, but someone who truly understood and respected the land. His work ethic was unquestionable, his judgment was sound, and his commitment to the ranch was absolute. The addition of Sarah to their small community had brought new energy and expertise that was already paying dividends. More than that, Ray had come to love both Jake and Sarah like the children he and Martha had never had. Watching them build their relationship and plan their future together had given him a sense of legacy and continuity that he'd thought he would never experience. "There's something else," Ray said, his voice becoming more serious. "I've been thinking about the question Jake asked Sarah that first night. About what matters most in life." "Connection," Martha said immediately. She said connection was the most important thing. "Right. And I've been thinking about how that applies to us, to this place." Ray gestured toward the window, encompassing the entire ranch in his movement. "For 42 years, you and I have been connected to this land, to each other, to the work we've done here. But we've always known that connection would have to end someday. And now it doesn't have to," Martha said, understanding where her husband's thoughts were leading. "Now it doesn't have to," Ray agreed. "If Jake and Sarah take over the ranch, our connection to this place continues. Everything we've built here gets passed on to people who will honor it and make it better." As they stood there watching Jake and Sarah work, both Ray and Martha felt a sense of peace about the future that they hadn't experienced in years. The uncertainty about what would happen to their life's work had been replaced by the certainty that it would continue in capable and loving hands. Later that afternoon, Ray called Jake and Sarah into the ranch house for what he said was an important conversation. They gathered around the same kitchen table where they'd shared that first dinner 6 months ago, and Ray could see the nervous anticipation on both their faces. "Jake came to me yesterday with a proposal about buying the ranch," Ray began, and he saw Sarah reach for Jake's hand under the table. "I wanted to discuss it with Martha before I gave him an answer." Jake straightened in his chair, trying to read Ray's expression. "And what did you decide?" "We decided," Ray said, his serious tone giving way to a broad smile, "that we can't think of anything we'd like more than to see the two of you take over the Double R Ranch." The relief and joy on Jake and Sarah's faces was immediate and unmistakable. Sarah actually had tears in her eyes as she squeezed Jake's hand. "But," Ray continued, holding up a finger, "we have some conditions." Jake and Sarah exchanged a quick glance, both of them prepared to agree to almost anything. "First, we want to stay in the main house for at least another 5 years. We're not ready to retire completely, and we want to be here to help with the transition and to enjoy watching you two build your life together." "Of course," Jake said immediately. "We wouldn't want it any other way." "Second, we want the conservation work to continue and expand. Sarah, the projects you've initiated here have already attracted attention from environmental organizations throughout the region. We want the Double R to become a model for sustainable ranching that other operations can learn from." "That's exactly what I was hoping for," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "This place could become a real showcase for how ranching and conservation can work together." "And third," Martha chimed in with a mischievous smile, "we want to be invited to the wedding." Jake and Sarah looked at each other in surprise, and then both of them started laughing. "Well," Jake said, turning to Sarah, "I guess this is as good a time as any." To everyone's amazement, including his own, Jake stood up and walked around the table to where Sarah was sitting. "Sarah-chan, I know we've only known each other for 6 months, but I've never been more certain about anything in my life. Will you marry me?" Sarah looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Jake Morrison, yes. Absolutely yes." As Jake and Sarah embraced, Ray and Martha looked at each other with the satisfaction of people who had just witnessed something truly special. The question Jake had asked Sarah about what mattered most in life had started a chain of events that had brought them all exactly what they needed most. Over the following months, the transition proceeded smoothly. Jake and Sarah were married in a simple ceremony in the ranch's meadow, with Ray officiating and Martha providing a feast that was talked about throughout the county for months afterward. The conservation projects expanded, attracting funding and attention that brought visitors from across the country to learn about the Double R's innovative approaches. But more than any of the external changes, what mattered most was the sense of connection and purpose that all four of them had found. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the ranch house kitchen as Martha Hutchinson bustled around preparing breakfast for their unexpected guest. Martha was a woman who had found her calling in taking care of others, and having Sarah stay overnight had given her an opportunity to exercise that gift. At 63, she moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent 4 decades managing a ranch household. But Her movements were gentle and welcoming. Sarah sat at the large wooden kitchen table, looking much more relaxed than she had the night before. She was dressed in jeans and a sweater that Martha had lent her, clothes that somehow made her look younger and more approachable than her business suit had. Jake found himself stealing glances at her as he helped Martha set the table, surprised by how natural she looked in this rural setting. The evening before had been an unexpected revelation for all of them. Over Martha's pot roast dinner, the conversation had flowed easily between the four of them, touching on everything from Sarah's environmental science background to Jake's experiences working on ranches across 3 states. Ray had been particularly interested in Sarah's perspectives on sustainable ranching practices, and she had been genuinely fascinated by his stories about implementing conservation measures on the Double R Ranch. "I called Tommy at the garage in town," Ray said as he joined them at the breakfast table. "He can come out and take a look at your car this morning, but he warned me that if it needs a new radiator hose, he might have to order the part. Could take a day or 2 to get it in." Sarah's face fell slightly at this news. "My interview is at 10 this morning. I really can't afford to miss it." Jake had been thinking about Sarah's situation since he'd woken up before dawn, and he'd come up with what he thought might be a solution. "How far is your interview from here?" he asked. "About an hour and a half drive to Billings," Sarah replied, checking her phone for the exact location. "I could drive you," Jake offered, the words coming out before he'd fully thought them through. "I've got the morning free, and my truck is reliable. We could leave in about an hour, get you there with time to spare." The offer surprised everyone at the table, including Jake himself. He wasn't usually the type to go out of his way for strangers, but something about Sarah's situation and her obvious passion for her work had touched something in him. "I couldn't ask you to do that," Sarah protested, but Jake could see the hope in her eyes. "You've already done so much to help me." "It's not a problem," Jake insisted. "Besides, I've been thinking about what you said last night about connection being the most important thing in life. Maybe this is just the universe's way of connecting people who are supposed to meet." Martha beamed at Jake's words, clearly pleased by this unexpected philosophical side of their usually reserved ranch hand. Ray raised an eyebrow but said nothing, though Jake caught a knowing look pass between Ray and his wife. After breakfast, as Sarah gathered her interview materials and changed back into her business attire, Jake found himself alone with Ray in the barn, ostensibly to check on Honey, the pregnant mare. "That's a fine woman," Ray said without preamble as they examined the horse. "Smart, passionate about her work, and she's got a good heart. You can see it in the way she talks about what she wants to do." Jake nodded, focusing intently on adjusting Honey's blanket. "She seems nice enough." "Nice enough," Ray chuckled. "Son, I've been watching you for 8 years, and I've never seen you offer to drive anyone anywhere, let alone a woman you just met. Something about her has gotten your attention." Jake paused in his work, considering Ray's words. The older man had become something of a father figure to him over the years, and his observations usually carried weight. "I don't know what it is about her," Jake admitted. "But when she talked about connection being the most important thing in life, it was like she was speaking directly to something I'd been feeling but couldn't put into words." Ray leaned against the stall door, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Martha and I have been talking about expanding our conservation efforts here on the ranch. We've been doing well with the sustainable grazing and water management, but we could do more. We've been thinking about hiring someone with real expertise in environmental science to help us develop a comprehensive conservation plan." The implication of Ray's words hit Jake immediately. "You're thinking about offering Sarah a job?" "I'm thinking about a lot of things," Ray said carefully. "But first, let's see how her interview goes today. If she gets the job she's hoping for, then she'll be on her way to building the career she wants. But if she doesn't," he shrugged, "well, maybe the universe has other plans." As they drove toward Billings an hour later, Jake found himself in one of the most natural conversations he'd had with a woman in years. Sarah was nervous about her interview, but talking seemed to help calm her nerves, and she asked Jake thoughtful questions about his life and work that showed genuine interest rather than just polite small talk. "Have you always wanted to work on ranches?" she asked as they passed through a small town where the speed limit dropped to 25 miles per hour. "Not always," Jake replied, slowing down as they passed the local school where children were gathering for the morning bell. I actually studied business in college. Had dreams of working in corporate America, climbing the ladder, making a lot of money. I worked in Dallas for about 5 years after graduation. What changed your mind? Sarah asked, turning in her seat to face him more directly. Jake was quiet for a moment, considering how much of his story to share. I got married when I was 26 to a woman I'd been dating since college. We had all these plans for our future, big house in the suburbs, successful careers, the whole American dream package. But somewhere along the way, we realized we'd grown into completely different people who wanted completely different things. That must have been difficult, Sarah said softly. It was, Jake acknowledged. The divorce was messy and painful, and I found myself questioning everything I thought I wanted out of life. I'd been so focused on external success that I'd lost touch with what actually made me happy. So I sold everything, bought a truck, and started driving west. I ended up working on a ranch in Colorado, and something about that life just felt right. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing his story. It sounds like you found what you were looking for. I thought I had, Jake said, surprising himself with his honesty. But lately, I've been wondering if I've been hiding out more than actually living. Your answer to my question last night made me realize that I've been so focused on avoiding the kind of pain I went through with my divorce that I've also been avoiding the possibility of real connection. As they entered the outskirts of Billings, Sarah directed Jake toward the office building where her interview was scheduled. The conservation organization, Rocky Mountain Environmental Alliance, had their regional office on the 3rd floor of a modest building downtown. Thank you for this, Sarah said as Jake pulled into a parking spot near the building. Not just for the ride, but for everything. Last night was one of the most enjoyable evenings I've had in a long time. Your question about what matters most in life really made me think. What conclusion did you come to? Jake asked, curious about whether her perspective had evolved overnight. I think my answer is still the same, but it's deeper now, Sarah said, checking her reflection in the passenger side mirror and smoothing her hair. Connection is important, but it's not just about having people in your life. It's about finding people who see the world in a compatible way, who share your values, and support your dreams. People you can be completely honest with. Jake felt something shift in his chest at her words. That sounds like exactly the kind of connection worth looking for. As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to get out of the truck, Jake found himself doing something that was completely unlike his usual cautious approach to relationships. Sarah, can I ask you to dinner tonight? Regardless of how your interview goes, I'd like to continue our conversation. Sarah paused with her hand on the door handle, and Jake could see surprise and pleasure cross her face. I'd like that very much, she said. But let me get through this interview first. My head needs to be completely focused on this opportunity. Of course, Jake said. I'll wait here until you're done, and then we can figure out the rest. As Sarah walked toward the building, Jake found himself genuinely hoping that the interview would go well for her, even though part of him was already imagining what it might be like if she decided to stay in Montana. He realized that his question about what mattered most in life had been as much for his own benefit as for hers, and her answer was helping him understand what had been missing from his carefully constructed but emotionally distant life. 2 hours later, Sarah emerged from the building with an expression that Jake couldn't immediately read. As she approached the truck, he could see that she looked thoughtful rather than either elated or disappointed. How did it go? He asked as she got back into the passenger seat. It was interesting, Sarah said, buckling her seatbelt. They offered me the job. That's great news, Jake said, though he was surprised to find that his enthusiasm was mixed with an unexpected sense of loss. Congratulations. Thank you, Sarah said, but Jake could hear a note of uncertainty in her voice. The position is everything I thought I wanted. It's based here in Billings, with travel throughout Montana and Wyoming to work with ranchers on conservation projects. The salary is good, the benefits are excellent, and the work would be exactly what I've been training for. But, Jake prompted, sensing there was more to the story. But they want me to start immediately. As in, they'd like me to begin on Monday, which means I'd need to fly back to Seattle this weekend to pack up my apartment and arrange for my things to be shipped here. Sarah turned to look at Jake directly, and they made it clear that the job would require a lot of travel. I'd be on the road probably 3 weeks out of every month. Jake began to understand the source of her uncertainty. That doesn't sound like it would leave much time for building the kind of connections you were talking about. Exactly, Sarah said. Don't get me wrong. It's a wonderful opportunity, and 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately without any hesitation. But something about last night, and our conversation this morning, has me thinking about what I really want out of life. As they sat in the truck outside the office building, Jake realized that they had reached a moment that would determine the direction of all their futures. Sarah had the job she'd been working toward, but she was questioning whether it would actually give her the life she wanted. He had been living a safe but limited existence, and meeting her had made him realize how much he'd been missing. What if I told you there might be another option? Jake said, making a decision that surprised him with its boldness. What do you mean? Ray mentioned this morning that he and Martha have been thinking about hiring someone with environmental science expertise to help develop a comprehensive conservation plan for the Double R Ranch. It wouldn't be the same kind of position as what you were just offered, but it would be meaningful work, and you'd be able to stay in one place and build the kind of life you talked about. Sarah's eyes widened with interest and surprise. Are you serious? I'm completely serious, Jake said. And there's something else I should tell you. I think I'm falling for you, Sarah Chun. I know we just met, and I know it's crazy, but I haven't felt this kind of connection with anyone in 8 years. I don't want you to make your decision based on that, but I wanted you to know. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, and Jake held his breath, waiting for her response. Finally, she reached across the truck and took his hand. Jake Morrison, she said, a smile spreading across her face. I think you might be the most honest man I've ever met. And, for what it's worth, I'm feeling that connection too. As they drove back toward the Double R Ranch, both of them knew that they were heading into uncharted territory. Sarah had a decision to make between the secure job she'd been offered and the uncertain but potentially more fulfilling opportunity that was developing. Jake was opening his heart to the possibility of love for the first time in 8 years. And somewhere ahead of them, Ray and Martha were about to discover that their simple act of hospitality had set in motion a series of events that would change their own lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The Montana landscape rolled past them as they talked, planned, and began to envision a future that neither of them could have imagined 24 hours earlier. Jake's simple question about what mattered most in life had unlocked something in both of them, and they were beginning to discover that sometimes the most important answers come not from careful planning, but from being open to unexpected possibilities. The dust kicked up from the cattle hooves created a golden haze in the late afternoon sun as Jake Morrison guided his horse through the familiar trails of the Double R Ranch. At 35, Jake had spent more years in the saddle than most people had in their chosen careers. His weathered hands gripped the reins with the confidence that came from 2 decades of working cattle, mending fences, and living the honest life of a ranch hand. The Double R Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of Montana wilderness, where rolling hills met endless sky, and the nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away. Jake had called this place home for the past 8 years, ever since he drifted north from Texas after a painful divorce that had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about life and love. On this particular Tuesday evening in September, Jake was making his way back to the main house after checking on a pregnant mare in the far pasture. The mare, a beautiful chestnut named Honey, was due any day now, and Jake wanted to make sure she was comfortable and safe. As he rode past the creek that wound through the property, he noticed something unusual. A small Honda sedan sat parked on the side of the dirt road that led to the ranch, its hazard lights blinking weakly in the growing dusk. Steam was rising from under the hood, and Jake could see a figure standing beside the car, looking helpless and frustrated. Being the kind of man who couldn't pass by someone in trouble, Jake turned his horse toward the stranded vehicle. As he approached, he could see it was a young woman, probably in her late 20s, with long brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was dressed in business attire that looked completely out of place in this rural setting, a navy blue suit with heels that were definitely not made for gravel roads. She was holding a cell phone up in the air, moving it around in different directions, obviously trying to get a signal. "Evening, miss," Jake called out as he brought his horse to a stop about 10 feet away. "Looks like you might be having some car trouble." The woman looked up, and Jake could see the relief wash over her face at seeing another human being. She had kind brown eyes that reflected both exhaustion and worry. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, lowering her phone. "I've been stuck here for almost 2 hours. My car just started overheating, and I can't get any cell service to call for help." Jake dismounted his horse and walked over to take a look at the car. The acrid smell of antifreeze filled the air, and he could see a small puddle of green liquid forming under the engine. "Looks like you've got a coolant leak," he said, lifting the hood carefully to avoid the remaining steam. "This engine's been running way too hot. You're lucky it didn't seize up completely." "I don't know anything about cars," the woman admitted, wrapping her arms around herself as the evening air grew cooler. "I was driving to Billings for a job interview tomorrow morning. I left from Seattle this morning, and I thought I could make it in one day." She let out a frustrated sigh. "I should have stopped for the night somewhere, but I wanted to get there early and prepare." Jake studied the engine for a few moments, his experienced eye taking in the problem. The radiator hose had a split in it, probably from age and the stress of a long drive. It wasn't something that could be fixed on the side of the road without proper tools and parts. "Well, miss, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this car isn't going anywhere tonight," Jake said, closing the hood gently. "You're going to need a new radiator hose, and even if we could get the parts, it's getting too dark to work on it safely." The woman's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Jake thought she might start crying. "I can't miss this interview," she said quietly. "This job, it's everything I've been working toward. If I don't show up tomorrow morning, they'll give the position to someone else." Jake found himself genuinely curious about this well-dressed city woman who had ended up stranded in the middle of Montana ranch country. "What kind of job is it, if you don't mind me asking?" "It's a position with a conservation organization," she explained, her voice gaining some strength as she talked about something that clearly mattered to her. "They're working on preserving wildlife habitats and promoting sustainable ranching practices. I have a degree in environmental science, and I've been trying to get into this field for 3 years now. This is the first real opportunity I've had." Something about the way she talked about her work struck a chord with Jake. He'd always been interested in land conservation, having seen firsthand how important it was to take care of the land that provided their livelihood. The Double R Ranch where he worked followed many sustainable practices, and the owner, Ray Hutchinson, was known throughout the region for his commitment to environmental stewardship. "My name's Jake Morrison," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I work at the ranch just up the road there." "I'm Sarah Chun," she replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip that surprised him. "And I really appreciate you stopping to help. I was starting to think I'd have to spend the night in my car." Jake looked at the darkening sky and then back at Sarah's inappropriate clothing for a night outdoors in Montana. The temperature could drop significantly once the sun went down completely, and her business suit wouldn't provide much protection against the cold. "Listen, Sarah," he said, making a decision that felt right in his gut. "The ranch house has guest quarters, and my boss Ray is a decent man. If you'd like, I could take you up there for the night. In the morning, we can figure out how to get your car fixed and get you to your interview." Sarah hesitated, and Jake could see the internal debate playing out on her face. She was clearly weighing the risks of trusting a stranger against the reality of her situation. "I don't want to impose on your employer," she said finally. "You wouldn't be imposing," Jake assured her. "Ray's wife Martha loves having visitors. They don't get much company out here, and she'll probably insist on cooking you the biggest breakfast you've ever had." He paused, sensing her continued uncertainty. "Look, I understand if you're not comfortable with the idea, but honestly, it's not safe for you to stay out here alone all night. And if you really need to get to that interview tomorrow, this might be your best option." The sound of coyotes howling in the distance seemed to help make up Sarah's mind. "Okay," she said, nodding decisively. "I'll take you up on that offer. But let me get my interview materials from the car first." As Sarah gathered her belongings from the back seat of her car, Jake found himself oddly interested in learning more about this woman who had appeared so unexpectedly in his usually predictable world. There was something about her determination and the way she spoke about her work that reminded him of a passion he'd once felt but had somehow lost along the way. "Have you ever been on a ranch before?" Jake asked as he helped her with her bags and prepared to lead her back to where his horse waited patiently. "Never," Sarah admitted with a small smile. I grew up in suburban California, went to college in Oregon, and I've been living in Seattle for the past few years. The most rural place I've ever been is probably a state park. She looked around at the vast landscape surrounding them, her expression mixing apprehension with genuine curiosity. It's beautiful out here, but also a little overwhelming. Everything is so big. Jake chuckled. That's what most city folks say when they first come out here. But once you get used to it, it's hard to imagine living anywhere else. He gestured toward the rolling hills that stretched to the horizon. There's something about all this space that puts things in perspective, makes you realize how small most of our daily problems really are. As they walked toward his horse, Jake found himself asking a question that he hadn't planned to ask, a question that would later prove to be the pivotal moment that changed everything for all three of them. Sarah, he said, stopping for a moment and looking directly at her. Can I ask you something that might sound a little strange? She paused, her bag slung over her shoulder, and nodded. Sure. What do you think is the most important thing in life? I mean, if you had to choose just one thing that matters most, what would it be? The question seemed to surprise her, and she was quiet for a long moment, considering her answer carefully. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful and sincere. Honestly, I think it's connection. Connection to other people, to the natural world, to something bigger than yourself. She looked out at the landscape around them. I've spent so much time focused on my career, on achieving specific goals, but lately I've been realizing that none of it means much if you don't have real connections in your life. Her answer hit Jake in a way he hadn't expected. It was as if she had put words to feelings he'd been carrying around without really understanding them. He'd spent the last 8 years keeping people at a distance, focusing on his work, and trying to avoid the kind of emotional risk that had led to so much pain in his past. That's a good answer, he said quietly. I used to think success was the most important thing. Making something of yourself, proving your worth through what you accomplished. He paused, looking down at the ground. But I'm starting to think you might be right about the connection part. As they reached his horse, Jake realized that this simple conversation with a stranded stranger was stirring something in him that had been dormant for a very long time. He helped Sarah up onto the horse behind him, and as they began the ride back to the ranch house, he found himself wondering if this chance encounter might be the beginning of something significant. The ranch house came into view as they crested a small hill, its warm lights glowing like a beacon in the gathering darkness. Jake could see Ray's truck parked in the driveway, and smoke rising from the chimney, signs that the Hutchinsons were home, and probably settling in for a quiet evening. Ray and Martha have been married for 42 years, Jake said over his shoulder as they approached the house. They met when they were both working on a ranch in Wyoming, and they've been partners in every sense of the word ever since. Watching them together, it's something special. That sounds wonderful, Sarah replied, and Jake could hear a note of longing in her voice. I've never had that kind of partnership with anyone. Sometimes I wonder if I'm too focused on my career to make room for that kind of relationship. Before Jake could respond, the front door of the ranch house opened, and Ray Hutchinson stepped out onto the porch. Ray was a man in his mid-60s with silver hair and a face weathered by decades of outdoor work, but his eyes were sharp and kind. He raised a hand in greeting as Jake brought the horse to a stop. Evening, Jake, Ray called out. Looks like you've got company. As Jake dismounted and helped Sarah down from the horse, he realized that he was about to set in motion a series of events that none of them could anticipate. His simple question to Sarah about what mattered most in life had already begun to shift something fundamental in his own thinking, and he had a feeling that her presence at the ranch was going to impact more than just his own perspective. Ray, I'd like you to meet Sarah Chun, Jake said as they approached the porch. Her car broke down out on the road, and she needs a place to stay for the night. Ray's face immediately broke into a welcoming smile, and he stepped forward to greet their unexpected guest. Well, Sarah, any friend of Jake's is welcome here. Martha, he called into the house. We've got company for dinner. As they walked into the warmth and light of the ranch house, Jake caught Sarah's eye and saw something there that he recognized, a sense of stepping into unknown territory that might hold unexpected possibilities. He had no way of knowing that his philosophical question and Her honest answer were already beginning to weave a story that would transform not just their own lives, but the life of the man who was now welcoming them both into his home.